I will try talking about the occupation years of Istanbul from an architectural point of view. And my relation with the subject started during my master's thesis, completed in 2006, ages ago. And although my scholarly interests later extended to other areas in the following years, one side of me lived with this subject and I kept gathering material. And since then, there has been a rising interest on the study of the period, and many new researches have been conducted, and more publications are being released. And today, as in this conference, we have a much more diverse scholarly circle where we can all contribute to fulfill different aspects of the whole and try to understand the conditions of the unique environment of occupied Istanbul. In this limited time, the 20 minutes, it would be pitiful attempt for me to try to share a large load of information that's accumulated over this long period, but I will not give you new data, but instead I will focus on how we can make use of it for possible collective studies, and try to develop a methodology for how this material on built environment can be handled. A comprehensive overview of the basic timeline and the general layout of the occupation has been portrayed by Odile Moreau on the first day, and the audience of this conference is already familiar with it, so I will not repeat that. But after the defeated war, there was enormous demand for new spaces for a variety of newcomers during the period in question. However, for various obvious reasons, there is no dense building activity. The building stock required by these new situations, roughly these are hospitals, orphanages, shelters for immigrants, and the other buildings in relation to relief activities, the buildings needed for the organizational structures of the Allied forces, were in majority obtained by refunctioning existing buildings. So therefore, the period had not been interesting for studies in architecture. However, these spaces were to be provided. So instead of new building activity, the city became subject to a grand urban transformation during the occupation years. This is a process of adaptation and refunctioning in building and urban scale, which very much requires the architectural point of view for its examination. Functionally transformed, majority of these spaces are used for other purposes than they are originally designed for. Okay, the places to search for functional use of occupied Istanbul are various, of course. And there are archival sources, official state documents, old photographs, newspaper archives, memoirs, private archives of religious institutions, schools, monographs on historic buildings and neighborhoods, postcards, auction sites, and the list goes on. But back in mid-2000s, it was much easier to check the addresses of buildings, for example, given in the ads in newspapers, and find their locations, finding their current locations and confirming them, and if they still existed, of course. Because street names and house numbers in historic neighborhoods were compatible with the historic maps of the era. Today, this is becoming harder and harder. While occasionally some street names keep being altered, recently there have been some applications in changing the house numbers of certain streets with new systems. And I just wanted to note here that not only the material itself, but this data is something that has to be preserved for historic neighborhoods as well. It's like erasing the date and location data of a digital photo or something. So these long 5 years of armistice and allied occupation in Istanbul is an intense and complicated history with various actors. Considering the diversity of the stakeholders, multiple narratives should be developed for the history of the occupied Istanbul from perspectives of each different group. So this is actually one of the things this conference program is making. Numerous papers are concentrating on an aspect of the city from points of views of different stakeholders, while some of these aspects are more public with a greater sphere of influence. Some address to a limited, distinct group of users or audience and are either inaccessible or undesirable for the rest, such as jazz or some sports activities. Reading the memoirs, one can reconstruct such different experiences of Istanbul that often it is hard to believe people are talking about the same city or the same time period. And similar diversity is also valid for the organization and usage of spaces. And if they still exist, examining the actual spaces help us understand the experience of the people who used them. And as a method, definition of these stakeholders, their functional needs, and the definition of the providers of these needs have been guiding force in my study. A study on architectural spaces is just another means to reconstruct both the experience of the prominent figures, but also the micro histories of the ordinary peoples, locals, migrants, orphans, soldiers, their lives, their conditions, and their experience of the city. So coming now, in a very general overview, I have grouped the users and the functions roughly into three subgroups. One, providing the spaces for the consequences of war. Secondly, spaces used for the allied organizations, administrative things. Thirdly, spaces for the entertainment and social activities. But of course, these should also be separated into broader subgroups. For example, entertainment, but entertainment for who? So this differs between different stakeholders. So I'm starting with the consequences of war. As the capital of an empire defeated in the war, Istanbul had been exposed to a great amount of internal migration during the occupation years. Besides this, Russians escaping the Bolshevik Revolution were coming to Istanbul in big waves, and the city was famous for its fire disasters already due to the dense wooden texture. So this problem reached an enormous scale. Housing became an enormous scale housing problem during the occupation years. Among the major solutions developed for these problems were preparing shelters for the sufferers of fires and refugees, opening orphanages and schools for refugee children, and establishing hospitals. Controlling plagues and sanitation, municipal activities were not sufficient, and extra precautions were taken by the Allied forces. Among the health centers opened during the period, there were hospitals and nutrition centers, most of which were temporary, and quarantine ships. As the economic situation got worse, the operation of the orphanages hindered in great scale. Numerous orphanages were opened. The buildings used for the new orphanages were mainly old wooden houses, konak, and public buildings such as hospitals and barracks. A lot of problems appeared in the process of transforming these buildings into new functions. Health conditions, especially in terms of heating and ventilation, could not be sufficiently fulfilled. These orphanages were mostly overcrowded, and the heating was mainly done with small stoves, and opening the windows was causing heat loss. For the refugees, shelters were founded, of course, and temporary structures, as seen one in the slide, were constructed, and nutrition centers and schools were opened for the refugee children. At the first step, wooden huts, tents, kindergartens, cheap hostels, temporary hospitals, private dwellings, and hotels were used as urgently provided shelters. There were then tent camps in Haydarpaşa and in the Princess Islands, a camp composed of wooden huts and tents in Tuzla, and a Muslim camp near Davutpaşa barracks. Military regions and properties such as Davutpaşa and Gümüşsuyu barracks were transformed into shelters with the order of the Sultan. There were hospitals providing refugees with treatment free of charge and sheltering in the dormitories. Dormitories opened by relief organizations such as YWCA or White Cross were helping with this need. Some buildings which belonged to the congregations such as Andrea Han in Karaköy were transformed in order to serve the as refugee shelters. In terms of education, with the help of private enterprises and relief funds, numerous schools in various scales were opened. And an American battleship, this is an interesting example, an American battleship on the Heybeliada dock was transformed into a school, and its cabins were used as classrooms. There were only two schools open for the Turkish refugee children, one in Selimiye and the other one in the Davutpaşa camp, but the rest of the Turkish children were trying to attend orphanage schools or ordinary primary schools. The regions that the Russians mostly chose to settle were Büyükada, Heybeliada, Şişli, and Beyoğlu. But Russians had a great impact on the social life of the city, but everybody kind of is familiar here with that as much as I know. So this is a very well studied subject, so I will not mention much of it here about those spaces. Houses that are normally used by one family in the ordinary times were used by multiple families, 5, 6 together, both because of the increase in population and because of the economic situation. And above all this, the building stock kept getting lost by fires. So these have caused the need of the formation of new regulations about buildings. So the shelters provided for the people who lost their houses to fires can be examined under different categories. Well, first, the solutions provided by some existing buildings, like mosques, like religious structures, empty homes, they're very temporary. Secondly, temporary and light structures such as tent camps. But thirdly, this is important, permanent buildings that represent the first housing estates in Istanbul were formed this way. Therefore, the fire sufferers. These were the apartment buildings composed of small-scale flats in Laleli and Yedikule, sponsored by the state, and they became the first buildings of the city with reinforced concrete structure and the earliest apartment buildings of the historical peninsula side. Relief organizations had a very wide activity area during the years of occupation, and they have taken part in many development plans, such as opening hospitals, founding public kitchens, shelters, and opening orphanages and schools. These institutions functioned in the fields of economy, sports, and entertainment. Only the American ones among all relief organizations chose to situate their centers in Istanbul area, the historical peninsula, where Muslim population was dominating. All the others were on the Galata part, and the headquarters, I mean. And this formed a center composed of these centers of YMCA, YWCA, an American school in Gedikpaşa, American hospital in Çarşıkapı in its earlier location, American church in Langa, Bible house situated close by here, and institutions such as American Board Committee and American Bible Society. Consequences of war. This is very general overview. And for the Allied forces, for the spaces for their organizations, Allied inspection got organized as commissions. And these commissions were inspecting both local and Allied organs. And the needed building stock was provided by the Allied seizing committee, seizing commission. Among the seized places, priority was given to the properties of the members of İttihat and Terakki, and primarily Enver Pasha and his family. And during the occupation, numerous Allied headquarters were established. Among these were Pembeköşk, 4. Vakıfhan, for example, which is transformed into a hotel today, but was used as the French headquarters with a signboard saying Kazanlı Victor. In Istanbul, there were 2 types of police stations during this period. One, of course, the old one by the Ottoman police stations, the new ones opened by the occupiers. And the center of the Turkish police department was bound to the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and it was situated in Şahin Paşa Hotel in Sirkeci. The police organization of the Allied forces determined 6 centers for activity zones in the city: Pera, Galata, Şişli, Suriçi 1, surrounding Ayasofya, and Suriçi, Intramuros 2, Beyazıt, and Üsküdar. The Allied forces had 4 or 5 temporary prisons that are known in Istanbul. Also, they have established torture centers, which were much more in number. And among these, the building across to the Yunu Umumiye, the public debt administration, was used by all Allied troops together. And French troops had a prison in Kapı. British forces used Arap Khan, situated close to Galata Tower. They also used the Galata Customs House. And there was also a plan for an organized permanent prison in Kroker Hotel, and the model prison cells were being prepared for this project. I'll now jump to the last part of this very, very rough overview, the entertainment and social activity spaces. And well, among the entertainment and social activity places opened during the occupation, the biggest facilities were Moda Summer Club on the Asian side, and the British Naval and Military Gardens in Osman Bey. And well, there were some restaurants and bars established to serve just the members of the Allied forces and people of their nationality. An enormous rise in the number of cinemas as tools of propaganda have already been mentioned in this conference in the previous talks. And Majid, for example, was opened for the first time in a building designed as a cinema. In the list, we see Al-Hamra Cinema, which is still very well known today and subject to a lot of debate about its renewable. Anyway, several sports clubs were founded during this period, and some areas were chosen and designed for their use. Among the sports activities, volleyball, football, tennis, boxing, horseback riding, baseball, cricket, polo, hockey, hunting, and golf can be given as examples. Not all of them remained afterwards. YMCA had an important role in sports with its gymnasiums and sports programs. And Taksim Square was not yet designed as a square and was housing places to rent bicycles, horses, donkeys. There were two football fields unorganized there and two baseball fields. The first organized football field was was the one in Moda Union Club, and the second was the courtyard of Topçu Barracks. And based on the advertisements published in the newspapers, it can be concluded that the areas chosen by members of Allied troops and foreign civilians were mainly around Nişantaşı and Pera. Bebek, Arnavutköy, Yeniköy, and Rumeli Hisarı were also among the popular places. While flats and apartment buildings and rooms were rented in and around Pera, there were also a lot of big mansions for rent and for sale on the Asian side in Moda and Kadıköy. And before the occupation years, where for nightlife entertainment, taverns took the first place. And especially after Tanzimat reorganization in 1839 to 76, the number of taverns in the city increased. But although forbidden, there were several brothels, even in the Muslim neighborhoods like Aksaray, and there were also nightclubs and bars, but these were less in number. Over this background, the bars, restaurants, dancing, cafes, and institutions of the sort opened by the Russian refugees have introduced Istanbul a new understanding of entertainment. And these innovations did not stop when most of the Russian refugee population left the city in 1924. Okay, overall, this layout has already been arranged in accordance with different functional needs of different permanent or temporary stakeholders of occupied Istanbul. So a lot of more research, fields of research can be made, like because of case studies can be done on specific buildings, changes in specific neighborhoods, municipal deeds, usage of shores, etc. But this data will extremely be useful and meaningful in collective studies where political, economic, social, artistic, and all other different aspects of living is reconstructed together with architecture, the spaces these activities are taking place in. So I'm looking forward for further discussion and maybe both during the conference and afterwards. And thank you for listening.